Hello, thank you for checking us out on Women's Accent Television. I'm your host, Judy Joseph. My guest is Judie Oron, journalist, philanthropist, and award-winning author of Cry of the Giraffe. Cry of the Giraffe is an award-winning book based on the true story of an Ethiopian Jewish teenager. Her name is Wuditu. Her harrowing trek from exile to slavery to hope in a new land. Her family fled religious persecution in Ethiopia to get to the Sudan with the hopes of getting to Israel. Wuditu and her younger sister Lewteh were separated from their family in a violent incident in a refugee camp in the Sudan. While the sisters were forced to return to Ethiopia, the rest of the family members were rescued on an airlift to Israel. Judie, so good to see you. Congratulations on a great novel. I'm not surprised that Cry of the Giraffe won so many awards, and it's what a great story. It's a hard story, but one about pain and triumph and hope in the end. Congratulations.
Thank you, Judy, and thank you so much for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here, and yes, it is a very difficult story. Unfortunately, when I hear that people are going to start reading the book, I kind of tell them to take Kleenex and hold on because there is a happy ending. Some sort of like cigarettes, sometimes I think there should be a warning put on the book. My daughter, Wuditu, this is a story essentially of a young Ethiopian Jewish girl who, while trying to get to Israel through a secret operation from Ethiopia, was asked with her family to walk to Sudan, a country where it's actually illegal to be there if you are a Jew, or it's certainly an Israeli, because it's an Arab country that considers itself an enemy of Israel. So because Ethiopia at the time was ruled by a Marxist government that was anti-religion, anti-all religions, including Judaism, there was a government that was at war and considered itself to need to be defended, so that if a person left Ethiopia, they would be considered a traitor.
But Judy, her family had to leave Ethiopia to get to the Sudan in order to get to Israel, and Israel made it possible for many Jews from Ethiopia to be taken to Israel in the early 80s under Operation Moses. Please tell us about that. We'll get back to your daughter as well. Sure.
As I said, Ethiopia was ruled by a Marxist dictator. It was illegal to leave Ethiopia. The Jewish community in Ethiopia had always wanted for as you say, thousands of years to leave the country and join their brothers in Israel. And sometime in the late 70s and beginning of the early 80s, the Israeli government decided to create an operation, something they're very good at. And so they went into the villages, they sent people into the villages in Ethiopia, the Ethiopian Jewish villages, and they told people to walk hundreds of kilometers to Sudan, as I said, a country where they're not allowed to be, to hide the fact that they're Jews, wait in the refugee camps, and Israel would land planes in the desert in secret and fly them to Israel. So as part of that wider operation, a man named Berihun in 1989 decided to take his family to Sudan in hopes of getting to Israel. And that's really the beginning of Cry of the Giraffe, when two young girls who were part of this family were kidnapped from the family, forced to walk back to Ethiopia. And from there, things just went completely downhill.
So the family left Ethiopia, got to Sudan with the hopes of getting to Israel. Something happened at refugee camp, and the family separated.
Right.
And the two sisters were forced to get back, were forced to be taken back to Ethiopia. Things got worse. What happened when they went back to Ethiopia?
Well, when they went back, first of all, when they were separated from their family, it should be said they were aged 10 and 13. And these were village girls who had always lived with their greater family around them, and they had no idea how to survive on their own. Tragically, at the same time as they were being forced to walk hundreds of kilometers back to Ethiopia, their family was being airlifted to Israel. The rest of their parents and their siblings were being airlifted to Israel. So there was really no way that those two girls could have been reunited with their families at that point. The younger child, Lewteh, was very ill. And on the march back to Ethiopia from Sudan, it became clear that she was barely conscious and could not walk much further. So Wuditu decided to leave her sister in a village where there were people that she knew.
Yes.
And to walk to a neighboring market town called Amba Giorgis to look for foreigners who were reputedly trying to take the Jews that were remaining in that part of Ethiopia to the capital city and from there to Israel. So this was a moment of hope for Wuditu. She was worried about her sister. She was terrified that her sister would become ill before she could find these foreigners, but at least there was a kind of a sense that maybe she and her sister might be saved if they could just find these foreigners who were taking the Jews to Israel. Unfortunately, things did not work out, as you know, because I know you read the book.
Yes, yes. I'm going to get back to Wuditu and her sister Lewteh. Wuditu and her family, they are black Jews from Ethiopia, but it goes way back, thousands and thousands of years. The Beta Israeli Jews, or black Jews in Ethiopia, once lived in Israel, and after the temple was destroyed, thousands and thousands of it, this once mighty tribe found their way through the Nile to Ethiopia. Tell us some more about the Beta Israelis.
Yeah, you're right, Judy. It's an amazing story. It's a story of legends, essentially. After the fall of the first temple in Israel, the Jews were dispersed all over the world. Some of them had ended up in all kinds of places that we're only finding out about now. And one of the groups that supposedly, none of this is written in stone. For every Ethiopian Jew, there's a theory about how all of this actually happened. But we do have some historical evidence. And this particular tribe was, according to the chief rabbi of Israel, these people were the Dan tribe. And the Dan tribe was quite dark. And they fled into Egypt, where they stayed for about 300 years, and hoping always to get back to Israel. Things were not getting any better in Israel, so eventually there was a decision to follow the Blue Nile River into Ethiopia, where they had heard that there was a legend that there was a Jewish kingdom, which actually was not true, but that was the safest place they thought they could go.
Yes.
And so that's how they ended up there. And in fact, there they established a Jewish kingdom. And they ruled over that part of Ethiopia for hundreds of years.
But they faced a lot of persecution.
They faced a lot of persecution from two sides. They faced persecution from the Muslims to the east, and what would later be Sudan, and from the new Christian community that was developing in Ethiopia. And eventually, the two of them got together and overthrew the Jewish kingdom. The Jews were dispersed into the highlands, where they lived in very remote villages until the 1950s, when they began to start coming to Israel.
Judy, let's get back to that's fascinating. Thank you for that brief history. Let's get back to Cry of the Giraffe, this terrific book. And I got to tell you, Judy, I'm kind of like an emotional person a little bit. I've been known to cry at movies, but I don't recall crying after reading a book. But this book made me cry.
Wow.
And I want you to take us back a little bit to how you found out about this family. They split up. They ended up, as I said, the two sisters went back, forcibly taken back to Ethiopia. Their families back in Israel. How did all that get together? Right. Tell us how you put all the dots together and brought them together. That's fascinating.
Oh, gosh. Well, I was.
How did you get involved?
How did I get involved? I think I really have to start with that. So I was working as a journalist for the Jerusalem Post, and in 1985, at about the period where we became aware that there were Ethiopian Jews coming from Sudan, I was asked to direct the Jerusalem Post newspaper's charitable funds, and so I started going around Israel looking at what the needs were. These were people who came out of the desert with nothing but the clothes on their backs. And so we were going around looking for their needs. And I would write a weekly column. Money would pour in from all over the world, including Canada. And we started to fund things. And one day a man came to me asking me to help, for the newspaper, to help him bring his 6 family members from Ethiopia to Israel. He wanted money, and my committee turned him down. And I was very upset because I grew up during the years when we discovered what happened in the Holocaust.
Yes.
And I used to ask my relatives and my friends, why didn't somebody do something to save people?
Yes.
There was no answer. And so I always thought, if an opportunity were presented to me, I wouldn't just sit back and do nothing.
Do something, yeah.
And so after talking to my kids and being very disappointed because my committee had turned this man down, and my kids popped up and said, well, you always said you would do something. Here's your chance, right? So we dug into our overdraft, and eventually we sent this man off. He succeeded brilliantly, managed to bring his family members off, and also to gather around him so many children that had been separated from their families in Sudan and bring them to Israel. So eventually I left the Jerusalem Post, and I began to gather together a bunch of friends, and we started working to try to find people who had gotten lost in this march to Sudan, because there were hundreds of people that were lost, many people that died on the way. And there were a lot of people in Israel who had no idea what had happened to their relatives. So in 1990, I was in Ethiopia looking for another family that had nothing to do with the 2 girls who eventually became my daughters.
Yes.
And somebody in the Israeli embassy asked me if I would look after this 10-year-old child. They said she had been separated from her family in Sudan, somehow managed to make her way to Addis Ababa, to the capital, and to the Israeli embassy. And these people were their tour of duty was up, so they were going back to Israel, and they asked would I take care of her. So I looked after her, and when the 2 of us got back to Israel, I went to see her with her parents.
And this is Lewteh.
This is Lewteh, who was then 10 years old. Okay. Fabulous little kid.
Yes.
Gorgeous little kid.
Yes.
And her father was very ill and nearly blind, and he told me 2 things, essentially. He said, first of all, that he saw I had a good relationship with Lewteh. He was very ill. He felt he was dying. He asked, would I take her into my family? Yes. We agreed. Everybody in the family agreed, and so we took her into our family.
Okay, so now you have Lewteh in your family.
Right.
Something in the book, again, that just made me so sad was when Lewteh said to you she was sure that her sister was still alive and that she can hear her breathing. And at that point, that propelled you into taking action. And you left and you went to Ethiopia on your own. You got to tell us about that, Judie.
Right.
That was brave. That's a lot of chutzpah, right?
Right. Well, I am Israeli. Chutzpah is part of the deal. One of the things that Lewteh's father had told me was that he was so ill, he knew another child had gone missing while they were in Sudan. He paid someone to go look for her. The man took his money, went supposedly to Ethiopia, came back and said Wuditu was dead. So for 2 years, Lewteh grew up in my family. I never asked her about the dead sister. I was afraid to poke my finger in the wound.
Yes.
And then one night, 3 a.m, I wake up to find her crying and telling me that she thinks her sister is alive. She's writing a letter to this dead sister, and she doesn't know the address.
Wow.
I started to ask around, and, I started thinking there's a war going on there. This kid would now be 16, 17 years old. If she's alone out there, somebody has to do something, right? So I went out there thinking, okay, I would get help from the Israeli embassy. It wouldn't be too terrible. Wouldn't be too scary. Yes. But it turned out to be I did get a lot of help from the embassy. They were fabulous. Yes. But it turned out to be a lot scarier than I thought it was going to be.
And tell us what you found once you got to Ethiopia. What did you...
Oh, gosh.
Wow.
Well, it was just after the war, the revolution.
Yes.
Guns and demobbed soldiers everywhere living off the land. So crime was really high.
Yes.
Everything was destroyed, the water infrastructure, everything was falling apart. There was a real sense of Wild West.
But you were on a mission. You wanted to find the sister.
I wanted to find her sister, so I had Lewteh's face and tears in my heart all the time.
Yes.
And her father, this poor man who clearly didn't have a lot of time to live, I just felt like I've got to bring, I've got to bring this kid back to him, you know. And at one point, I went out with the Israeli embassy. We looked for her. We ran into a mob scene, and we had to leave the town where I eventually did find her.
Yes.
And I was told to basically not go anywhere without armed guards. But my visa was ending. So I knew that if I didn't find her soon, I might not get a chance to come back. That was kind of what drove me to get out there.
So you found Wuditu, and you come back to Israel.
Right.
And you bring this family back together. That must have how did you feel when that happened?
You know, it's funny because there was a part of me that felt triumphant.
Yes.
How could you not? It was a needle in a haystack. Unbelievable that we actually found each other and that we survived a mob scene, which, if anybody reads the book, they'll read about. But there was a huge sense of shame. And every time I say that to people, they want to understand why I felt ashamed, and I can't explain it. The closest I can come to is the fact that, you know, you give someone a few smelly, dirty pieces of local currency, and they give you a person, a human being, who clearly had been beaten, who clearly was malnourished, who was terrified. To this day, I feel ashamed. I don't know why. With all the triumph and the feeling of I did it, you know, which was certainly there. The idea that there are so many children out there in that situation, and I just took one of them, you know?
Yeah, let's talk about child slavery, because it's a topic that we don't hear about a lot in Africa. So tell us what you know and what troubles you so much about child slavery, particularly what you saw in Ethiopia.
I think on my first trip to Ethiopia, I would see a lot of children sleeping in the streets. I would see children wrapped in white, lying in the streets in the morning when I would get up, with bullet holes in them and blood signs. Sorry.
Yeah.
I would see children begging. I would see children who clearly were being exploited in all kinds of ways. I didn't see help for them. Maybe it exists, but I didn't see it. But I certainly didn't think of it as slavery. And even though I had essentially bought a human being, brought her to my family, raised her to some extent, and learned a lot about what she went through, it was a period where we weren't really talking about modern-day slavery. Mm-hmm. It was still a foreign concept. It took me a long time to understand that what I had dealt with and what was actually happening out there was a huge amount of children who were being trafficked, enslaved, bride, kidnapped. I can go on and on with ultimate variations of how children are being exploited and enslaved in one way or another in the Horn of Africa.
Judie, when we hear about child slavery, which is a very difficult topic, we think of countries like Thailand and maybe even Cuba and the sex-traded children, but we don't think about what's happening in Africa. And what you know is what's happening in Ethiopia. What do you know? What do you see?
Well, I've been, ever since coming back from actually buying a slave and having raised someone and watching, although she was, quote, only 4 years a slave, and watching how hard she's still today struggling 21 years later to overcome her experience. I've been following what's happening in Ethiopia. And, we've had in Canada a lot of news stories recently about how there's a sex trade, as you say. And you have Canadian tourists and tourists from other parts of the world going to Thailand and other countries. You hear about slaves in other parts of Africa, possibly West Africa. You hear about soldier slaves. People are not talking about what's happening to children in Ethiopia and in the Horn of Africa.
And we're not talking child soldiers now, because it's different. Okay.
No, we're talking children that are being enslaved, kidnapped, trafficked, kidnapped as brides, trafficked to Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, Lebanon, and what to me is really galling, and one of the reasons why I've sort of gone from being a journalist to a writer to an activist in my old age is that I'm absolutely appalled when I see that countries like Canada, Britain, the United States, and Europe are giving an enormous amount of money in long-term help, to long-term development to Ethiopia. The government of Ethiopia is this really strange government that abuses its citizens, rarely has an election after only the 2 elections since 1991. They've actually been shooting people down in the streets who were protesting the corruption of the election. It's now illegal to speak on Skype in Ethiopia, punishable by jail apparently. And worse to me is that foreign NGOs, according to laws enacted a few years ago in Ethiopia, are no longer able to work in Ethiopia on what the Ethiopians have defined as social issues like child slavery. And so the only people who are allowed to work on social issues like child slavery are the Ethiopian government, who don't have the who aren't using the resources that people are giving them to help this issue, or local NGOs for whom another law was enacted that if 10% of their money comes from outside the country, they're not allowed to work on social issues. So here we have Canada, where we are right now, and other countries around the world that are giving Ethiopia money. They're not tying that money to long-term development, to human rights abuses and to helping some of these children, some of whom actually escape from slavery, wind up in the cities, and are then re-exploited in some other fashion.
Prostitution.
You only have to get off a plane in Ethiopia to see these children in the streets. And clearly, if all that long-term development money were being used properly, those kids would not be in the streets, they'd be in schools. I believe the Ethiopian government is doing something to help, but not enough.
So how do we in the West and how do we, what kind of pressure could we put on the Ethiopian government? Is there anything we can do?
Unfortunately, I'm a newbie as an activist. So help is all I can say.
Help, yeah.
You know, let's try to get the word out into the public forum, which is what I think Wuditu's story is helping to do.
Yes.
Let's try to get the word out about the Horn of Africa and what's happening to its children. You know, the important thing, of course, is to try to get into the public forum to raise awareness about what is happening to the Horn of Africa's children today.
But once we raise awareness, is what do we do after that? What can we do to effect change? And these young children, little children experiencing just in these horrific conditions.
I think if we get the word out and if we try to pressure our governments to link any financial aid. To a very struggling country like Ethiopia, I don't think Ethiopia would survive without money from these governments. We can link that money. We can force our governments to link that money to human rights issues.
But if there are no NGOs there to see,
there are NGOs there.
There are,
but they're not working on social issues.
They're not working on social issues. And as we said earlier, when Wuditu and her sister Lewteh were forced to be taken back to Ethiopia, as we said, things got worse for them. And in the book, but what's amazing, with such pain and heartache and persecution, this family was such a real family in the sense that there was joy and music. Right. I remember in chapter 1, Wuditu talked about that beautiful song, The Bird, have been to Jerusalem and is about to go back, and the mother would sing that song for her. So with all this pain, there was such love in that family and song and music. And in spite of the hardships that she was facing in Ethiopia, I felt that she always felt that she was going to see her parents again, that they will be reunited.
I think this is a girl. She's an extraordinary person. I'm not objective. I admit it, but she is an extraordinary human being. But apart from the fact that she is amazing, she really comes from an amazing group of people, the Beta Israel. From the moment they're born, they're raised with Jewish values. These are people who are living according to the Torah, according to the Bible.
So they're deeply religious.
They're deeply religious, and they have a very deep moral fiber.
And Judy, what does Beta mean?
Beta means a house. Beta Israel means House of Israel.
House of Israel.
So they've always called themselves House of Israel.
And they speak Hebrew, correct?
No, they spoke Amharic.
I see. Is that close?
But their holy language is very similar to Aramaic, which is the written language of the Bible.
I see.
So,
interesting.
Yeah.
So now,
And I think, sorry to interrupt, but I think these values really sustained her. Her family, the closeness of her family, the richness of the life that they lived. Richness not in money, but in morals and in ethical values, and I think they were a happy family.
And you get that from the book.
Definitely,
they were poor.
There was a lot of joy in that family.
They were poor, and there was a lot of persecution, but the sense of family and love and music and coming together.
Right.
I think that sustained her all through what she was experiencing as a very young girl. That no young girl anywhere in the world should experience.
Right.
So everyone's back now in Israel, and you told your family you're going to adopt these two girls from Ethiopia, from a culture that is vastly different from yours. What did they say, your family, when you told them that you're going to bring these two strange girls? They look different, and they were different, into your home.
Right. I mean, the fact that I took two traumatized Ethiopian Jewish girls from a very different kind of a world and plunked them down among my slightly spoiled Israeli sons. And they're still speaking to me, which is amazing. I should be knocking on wood here. First of all, throughout this whole process, I mean, this was not the first incident that I was involved in trying to find people who were lost. And so I had some experience, and I couldn't have done a lot of what I did without my son's help, because they were amazing on computers and I was very bad on computers. And so if we had to create documentation, or if we had to fill out what used to be reunification forms for the Ethiopian government, they were so involved. To them, it was like a detective story. Oh, we didn't find her here. We lost that file. Oh, okay, but we could look there. Let's check that out. So they were very
putting
involved.
The pieces together.
Yeah. And I think, being totally unobjective again, I think these are two amazing kids who were willing to look beyond the externals and be big brothers to these girls.
But I'm sure there had to have been some challenges, though, because it's a new world completely for these two young girls, already traumatized by what they experienced.
Right.
So how did they overcome those challenges?
I think the dog had the hardest time. Lewteh would pull his tail endlessly. No, I'm being facetious here. I think, it was tough. It was tough. It was, first of all, a middle-class Israeli family has to deal with trauma because we have war, we have bombings, we have all of that to deal with. Even if it doesn't directly, thank God, touch us, it's everywhere. It's in the air.
It's around you.
But we never had to deal with this kind of trauma of someone being grabbed from their family, abused in every way you can possibly imagine. I think it really humanized the boys. They could have gone either way.
Yes.
Yes. And I'm eternally grateful that they became the human beings they are today.
That's amazing. Judie, when Wuditu knocked on that door, and the door opened, and her mother was on the other side, and they didn't recognize each other right away, I wept. I found that so emotional. That here is the mother, and for the first few seconds, they had no idea. That was her mother.
No. You're going to make me cry now.
Because she had changed so much in a short time.
Wuditu was emaciated. When I brought her to a doctor a few days after I found her, he looked at her and he said to me, "You're going to have to prepare yourself. She may not survive."
Oh, wow.
So the fact that her mother didn't recognize her was not amazing.
But she did not recognize
and her mother
the
had aged terribly.
Yes.
Aged terribly. I mean, to have your daughter stolen from you definitely ages you. And, but unfortunately, they overcame the moment. And
I also want to ask you how, not just this family, with Wuditu and her sister and her family, but the Beta Israelis, how are they integrating into the Israeli society?
Wow. That's a bit of a complicated answer because there's 130,000 of them in Israel. I think in general, like a lot of the waves of immigration that have come to Israel, the older generation, it's like that first pancake, you have to throw it away, and make the next pancake.
The next layers.
Right, exactly. The older generation, by and large, are a little bit bewildered and have not always made the most successful absorption.
Yes.
the younger generation have done really, really well. And although there have been at times challenges in education, they a lot of trouble learning English for some reason. Hebrew, they do really well quickly. English, not so well for some reason. So there are a lot of, we have a huge number of kids who have gone through university, which, you know, when I was looking at the statistics the other day, there are 5,000 kids from the Ethiopian Jewish community.
5,000,
for a first generation, that is huge.
That's excellent.
But there are gaps that prevent them from going into certain fields where they still need to catch up.
Yes.
And like any country, you have some issues of racism.
Absolutely, and this is not unique to Israel. I mean, every refugee story, it's a very similar journey, and they face challenges in a new homeland, new country.
I think in macro, you've got an amazing excitement to have this lost tribe come to Israel, and I think they were greeted with enormous excitement.
Yes.
And then in theory, things break down in micro.
Reality steps in. Judy, as I said, it's a hard book to read, but with such pain and joy, and at the end, hope. And thank you for sharing this story. But before we say goodbye, a little superficial note. The first Miss Israel, the first black Miss Israel is Ethiopian, and she's absolutely beautiful. But I also want to ask you about the title of the book. It's a great book, Cry of the Giraffe. Wuditu has a long neck. First of all, she's beautiful, and she has a long neck like a giraffe. So how did this name, the title of the book, come about?
Oh, gosh.
Because I also remember her mother telling her in the book that giraffes don't cry.
Right.
Maybe they do.
Actually, I sort of looked that up. Actually, this is not my title. My editor chose it.
Oh.
I don't think I've ever, in 40 years of journalism, I've never been able to actually keep a title without being edited. But Wuditu, actually what's interesting is when I found Wuditu, as you know, I found her in the midst of a mob scene in a car. She was thrown into a car, and people were trying to turn the car upside down. So my camera fell into the back seat. And after we escaped the mob, and we managed to get to a fairly safe place where we were sure they weren't chasing us, she asked me to photograph her. And it was one of those old cameras, you know, that you had to fiddle with all kinds of different things. And so I would fiddle and stand her up behind a really beautiful mountain, and then she would I would look through the lens when I was finished fiddling, and there'd be blank, no Wuditu. And so I would look aside, and she'd be bowing with her nose touching the ground, because I guess that's what she had to do. So I would, you know, motion, get up, get up, get up, and then I would start fiddling again. Again, she would be bowing. And so to try to make her stand up, because to me this was shameful. Mm-hmm. And an example of how she was abased.
Yes.
So I said to her, you know, you're going to be an Israeli soon. We don't bow before people. We bow before God.
Yes.
So you'll have to learn to keep your beautiful long neck straight. And I said, you have a neck like a giraffe. And she started to laugh. And I was shocked, because half an hour before we thought we were going to die. And there she is laughing and looking like a complete teenager, you know.
Yes.
I said, what's so funny? And she said, my mother used to tell me that I have a long neck like my grandmother, and if times are difficult, I mustn't, like the giraffe, I mustn't cry, because giraffes don't cry.
Yeah. Oh, what a great story, Judy. I urge anyone who's going to read this book to get maybe a box of Kleenex close by. But it's a great read, and it's a story worth telling. So thank you very much.
Thank you,
and
Judy.
thank you for chatting with us.
Oh, you're very welcome. It's been lovely.
Thank you.